We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week.
Moldova has voted to join the EU, a referendum won by less than a single percentage point. It's less clear when the EU's citizens get their vote on whether they want to house a very poor, seriously divided, minority Russian post-Soviet state. Surely this is the moment the eastwards expansion runs aground in the geopolitical reality.
Meanwhile, China and India have quietly settled their long-running border dispute in the Himalayas. Far from the recent era where rival troops would run at each other with sticks, or even the notorious 2020 microwaving incident, this bizarre superpower friction seems to have been cleared up inside a few paragraphs. Is this proof positive that the BRICS are turning their attentions outwards?
Finally, the story that the Trump campaign has launched a complaint against the British Labour Party has spooked the Starmer regime. Staffers campaigning for their Democratic Party cognates seemed like a cute idea and a nice holiday. But if these naive limeys want to know how strictly Americans take their electoral laws, they should have dropped a dime to Steve Bannon's prison cell.
But first,
join the club.
This week, listeners might be aware that Moldova had a referendum on EU membership, whether to start along the path of becoming an EU member. It was a referendum that was needed because Moldova is constitutionally neutral, and of course, by moving along the road toward EU membership, it would no longer be neutral in that sense. So they had a referendum. Polls beforehand showed a considerable majority of people supporting this referendum question that yes, they would move toward EU membership. However, in the event, it was far closer than that. In fact, right up until the last moment, the no vote, no, we should maintain our constitutional neutrality and not move along this path, had a majority. And it was only the last minute addition of votes from 500,000 Moldovan citizens living abroad, many of whom live and work in the EU, that gave the yes vote a knife edge victory. So yes actually won with 50.4% of the vote against no's 49.6%. And as I say, that they only got across the line due to the votes from predominantly EU-based Moldovan expats. There are a lot of Moldovans who also live in Russia, but they apparently did not vote in such great numbers in the referendum, and overall it was a very low turnout. I think it's fair to say that this has not been a good referendum for the cause of EU membership in Moldova, or indeed the very pro-Western EU president, Maia Sandu. And I think it's worth looking at Moldova, which is largely unknown in the West. People know very little about Moldova, what it is, where it is, what it's all about. I think it's worth looking at because in some ways, I think it's actually quite similar to Ukraine and the situation that Ukraine has found itself in the last decade or two. It's a much smaller country, but it's very similar and very much a battleground state between the West and Russia, essentially. So for those people who, like me, quite like looking at old maps of the world, old geopolitical maps, they will have seen there a territory that doesn't exist now called Bessarabia. Now, at the end of the Russo-Turkey War, Russia and Turkey signed the Treaty of Bucharest in 1812 that annexed Bessarabia to Russia. Bessarabia became Russia. And after the Russian Revolution, Bessarabia reformed itself as the Moldovan Soviet Republic and became part of the Soviet Union. It transferred from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union under the name of Moldova. Now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova became independent, but it became a constitutionally neutral country. And rather like Ukraine, actually, it was split linguistically in terms of its kind of its cultural heritage, essentially between Romania, which is a Latin-speaking country, and these days part of the EU, part of the Western Alliance, part of NATO, and the Russian-speaking part. There is also a Moldovan-speaking part, but Moldova is considered by most people a kind of a dialect of Romanian. Now, what's happened since is something very similar to that which happened in Ukraine, where you have in Moldova moneyed interests and power groupings which are generally pro-Russian, and power groupings which are essentially pro-Western. And it's in fact the pro-Western group, and especially those who are Romanian citizens and who would like Moldova to merge with Romania, kind of to become part of Romania and therefore part of the EU directly and part of NATO directly, who have held sway. The president is a Romanian citizen as well as Moldovan, the president of the parliament, the prime minister, the minister of foreign affairs, most of the ministers and members of the Moldovan parliament, most of the heads of state officers, and members of the Constitutional Court, and the head of the Secret Service are all Romanian citizens. And they're all very much pro-merger with Romania, and all very much pro-EU and pro-West. Since the war in Ukraine, this grouping has had an opportunity to cement that role. So it has proscribed, it's banned the pro-Russian political party run by Ilan Shor, who is a Israeli-born Moldovan oligarch, I suppose you could say, and also politician. It has banned flights from Russia following the EU lead, and banned payments to and from Russia, despite the fact that a large number of citizens, I believe 500,000, actually live and work in Russia and send remittances back to Moldova as an important part of the Moldovan economy. Actually, a lot of people rely on those remittances. Meantime, according to the former head of state, Igor Dodon, there are over 10,000 pro-Western NGOs operating in Moldova. And at the same time, Russian media has been banned in Moldova. So there's been quite a bit of kind of oppression, I suppose you might say, of the pro-Russian political perspective in Moldova since the war. So, you're seeing something very similar to that which is happening in Ukraine. And I would say that, given the preeminence of the pro-Western camp in Moldova, to have such a knife-edge vote, 50.4 to 49.6, while it's a technical victory, it was a relatively low turnout. And it's so close that I think really it represents a moral defeat for these forces. There have been complaints, I should say, of Russian meddling, and especially through Ilan Shor, the oligarch, the pro-Russian oligarch I mentioned earlier. But I haven't as yet seen evidence of that. There was talk that they were paying people to vote in person. No. But as yet, I've seen no evidence of that. It might be true. But this is turning into yet another battleground state between the West and the EU. And as quite a poor state, in terms of GDP per capita, it's about on the same level as Botswana, if you look in nominal terms, or Peru, if you look in PPP terms. It's a very poor state by European standards. And this meddling perhaps won't do much good for Moldova as a whole, this great battle. Certainly if they do things like block trade with Russia, which was previously a very large trading partner, and block remittances, which was an important source of income for Moldovans. It's not necessarily going to do much good for Moldova, but I think more importantly than that, it's something that's worth following in terms of where the line between Western Europe and East is ultimately going to be drawn. Is Moldova going to be on the Russian side or the Western side? And more than that, can Moldova maintain its status as something of a buffer state, as a multicultural, multilinguistic, neutral state that is neither in the Western camp or in the Russian camp, and can actually freely trade and maintain good relationships with both sides?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting debate in a sense, but I think I think the Moldovan question has become a little bit of a Western hall of mirrors. So if you go and you look at the headlines on Moldova on the day of recording, which a load of them are out, it's like The Guardian has one that says, "In Moldova, we held our EU referendum in Russia's shadow." Politico say, "Moldova and Georgia ring alarm bells for the EU." That's presumably referencing the recent referendum on a anti-NGO law, a foreign influence law in Georgia. But my feeling on it is, and maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I don't think Russia really care about Moldova. I don't think anyone really cares about Moldova. The West has got it in its head that Moldova is now important because they're spun up about the region and so on. But the reality is Moldova does not border Russia. It borders Ukraine. And there are already NATO members that border Russia, which are the Baltic states. They are in NATO. They border Russia. That is more of a threat to Russia than Moldova. Moldova is this small state in between Ukraine and Romania. Romania is a NATO state. Ukraine is what it is. And as I said, why would anyone care about Moldova? People in Moldova care about Moldova. I'm not trying to disparage Moldova, but nobody cares geopolitically about Moldova. That's the first point. Second point, EU membership is not NATO membership. If they want to join NATO, they can. I don't know the internal politics around that. As you say, there's a very large Russian ethnic population there, and so they probably don't want to be in NATO. I don't see what would happen negatively in terms of geopolitical stability if Moldova joined NATO. But again, NATO is not the EU. And I can't see why Russia would have any objection at all to Moldova joining the EU. In fact, I think they'd probably be in favor of it from a theoretical point of view, for the simple reason that you would then have a bloc of, close to half the population, which are pro-Russian in a sense, in an EU country. That's kind of advantageous. The Central European view on it, I'm talking kind of about the kind of Hungarian, Slovakian kind of sovereigntist view, is more EU is better in the region. The Orban government, for example, in their EU presidency, is pushing for EU expansion for Georgia, Serbia, and so on. I don't know their position on Moldova. I probably should have looked it up before the show, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were okay with Moldova joining. I looked it up there to try and find out if Russia had made a statement on Moldova. The Wikipedia page says that Sergei Lavrov said that they'd be the next Ukraine if they joined. And I clicked through on the link that they provide, and Sergei Lavrov says nothing of the sort. He basically says if the Moldovans want to be absorbed by Romania, that's up to them. And what he's doing there with that language is basically taunting the Romanian, the more Romanian minority or more Romanian ethnic group there, and highlighting to the more Russian ethnic group that going down this path might end up absorbing Moldova into Romania, which I assume the Russian group in the country don't want. But that's just, Lavrov playing the game, trying to stir up some tensions. Maybe there's a kind of a sense that they don't want, the language rights or something of the Russians trampled on if Moldova did become closer to Romania by joining the EU. But if you're in the EU, you can't trample on people's ethnic rights anyway. There's very strong protections in place. And in fact, the reason that some of these ethnic problems are in Ukraine is because Ukraine's been outside of the EU. So again, I really think that this is a massive hall of mirrors that the Western press have created for themselves. What is currently happening is the entire Western press has been told to focus on the Central European and Eastern European region. They're being told to look at elections in Georgia around NGO laws. They're being told to look at EU referenda in Moldova. And the meme that they're given is Russia's behind everything, the nefarious Russians. The reality is they've no clue about this region. They couldn't find these countries on a map if you asked them. And so they just use it as grist for their mill for like nonsense Russia controls the world, paranoid, late imperial fantasy stuff. So, I mean, I don't think it's that big a deal. It's interesting insofar as like if the EU expanded and Moldova became part of it, it might change the internal politics of the EU. That's certainly the sense that people get in the region if, for example, Serbia or Georgia join the EU. And I'm sure Moldova is another kind of, somewhat conservative country with some interesting political forces in it that could force it in a sovereigntist direction. But in terms of like Putin's interfering in the Moldovan election to like make sure that like, there's no NATO on his border, like they have NATO on the border, Moldova aren't on the Russian border. Again, I'll say it. Sorry if there's any Moldovans listening, but I don't think anyone cares about Moldova.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile talking very briefly about EU membership because Moldova is, I believe I'm right in saying, has EU membership candidate status, which means that the invitation is there to start down the process. That process takes a long time. We discussed last week regarding Serbia, that Serbia started its roadmap towards EU membership 10 years ago, and it's still nowhere near getting EU membership. So this is a very long process. I think for Turkey, it's been perhaps even longer, even though Turkey's a member of the EU Customs Union. So this is something that takes a huge amount of time and wouldn't happen anytime soon, even if Moldova decided it was going to go down this route, which remains to be seen given how close the referendum was. What I would say, though, about these countries, Moldova, Georgia, some other Balkan countries like North Macedonia, like Serbia, these countries are really poor by EU standards. Ukraine is another one that would be on the list. These countries are like massively poor by EU standards, and as I said, you're looking at a GDP per capita in nominal or price purchasing parity terms, close to places like Botswana, close to places like Peru. So like, Africa and the poor end of Latin America here. The transfer payments that these countries would be due, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, are huge. It would mean that all those countries in Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland, like the Baltic states, like Slovakia, like Hungary, like Croatia, which have enjoyed really big transfer payments, EU solidarity payments, that have really bolstered their economy, helped them maintain, balanced fiscal budgets and really helped them develop. That would all be gone. That, all these countries would suddenly become net contributors to the EU budget and massively so for the Western European countries like France and Germany and Ireland. I think there are very big barriers. Even if countries like Georgia and Ukraine clearly and Moldova wanted to join the European Union, what would these Eastern European countries say? Like already we have huge problems in Poland because of Ukrainian agricultural produce. Famously, Ukraine is a big producer of agriculture, although, compared with countries like Russia and even to some degree France, it's not as big as is made out. But already Polish farmers are like complaining hugely. Now, what happens when Ukraine and Moldova, which is also a pretty big, for its size, it's a big agricultural economy. What happens when they start getting access to the common agricultural policy funds from the EU? What happens when these countries suddenly have absolutely free access to the European single market and they can transfer their goods and their capital absolutely freely? Like, will France and Poland not, have huge problems from fairly big lobbies, which is the agricultural lobby within their countries, with agreeing to those things? What about the free movement of capital? Ukraine, Moldova. I'm less certain about Georgia, but certainly Ukraine and Moldova are infamous for their corruption, and infamous for some of the hugely rich billionaire businessmen, colloquially known in the West as oligarchs. Like, what happens when those guys have the right to free movement within the EU, the right to freely move their capital within the EU, the right to freely set up businesses and open bank accounts? Like, what happens then? There are like massive barriers to these countries joining the EU. And I think that some of this, some of the really bullish optimism of the kind of pro-federal EU sorts that you get in Brussels and certain capitals within the EU, of this new expansion in the Balkans, in Moldova, in Ukraine, and in the Caucasus, like a fresh wave of EU expansion. I really think it's like, almost childishly optimistic. It truly is. So, I think these votes, while they're important, I suppose, and in terms of a new territory for the great game to take place, and they're important in terms of Western journalists getting hot and sweaty about the ever-present spectre of Russian interference. I think they're less important than perhaps could be made out.
Chindia. At the time of recording, the BRICS meeting is taking place in Kazan in Russia. It's a huge deal. We won't actually go into the details of the meeting this week. I think we'll do that next week whenever things come out. But there are a few things to be said initially. First of all, the media coverage of BRICS Summit has been hilarious. There has been no media coverage, really. I mean, I'm not saying the media didn't cover it. You can go and search Google and you'll find a BBC article. And actually, Bloomberg haven't been too bad on it. But if you are a European and you're a very sophisticated person and you're in the political elite or the corporate elite or the financial elite, you're like in the power club, you pick up your Financial Times today and there is not a whisper about BRICS. I didn't see it on the front page of the Financial Times at all. Maybe there's a buried story. I didn't see it. But you won't be informed about this. And again, we'll go into what has taken place at BRICS next week when we have the final details. But just to give a kind of a preview, they are discussing a payment system that would replace SWIFT, which is an absolutely enormous deal. Again, we'll probably cover it next week. The media is not covering it. It's the craziest thing. It really is sometimes on the show, or maybe too often. Maybe listeners are getting sick of me doing late Soviet analysis, analogies about the West and so on. But this really is late Soviet. I mean, to have such a major event taking place. Just to underline this, there are a bunch of world leaders there. Vladimir Putin's there, Xi Jinping is there, Narendra Modi is there, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia is there, the foreign minister of Brazil is there. And by the way, the Crown Prince would have been there from Saudi Arabia, except for the Middle Eastern situation. So it's a meeting of world leaders. Usually, if you have any meeting with those kind of high-profile world leaders, of course, like a serious publication, I'm putting that in air quotes now because it's becoming increasingly less serious, like the Financial Times will cover that, because it's just like all these big leaders turned up. What are they talking about? That's interesting. And there's an agenda and so on. And they're not covering it. I think the real question there is, are they not covering the BRICS summit because they're still scared of talking about BRICS, which they have been for the past 2 years? It's been very noticeable. Or is the kind of BRICS thing moving over the line, as I feel it kind of is? I think it's becoming impossible to ignore. If you talk to people in foreign affairs circles and diplomatic circles, people talk about BRICS a lot now. And are they just scared to cover it because it's in Kazan in Russia? Because the Russian government is ultimately setting the tone of what is being billed as the most important BRICS meeting so far in history. Maybe it turns out to be the pivotal BRICS meeting. Is that why they're not covering it? Well, either way, the Western media is putting itself in a lot of trouble here. If everybody is talking about this stuff in diplomatic circles and foreign affairs circles, and you pick up a newspaper that's supposed to inform you of things, and you're not even told it's going on, or it's on page 36 under an ad for cold medicine or something like that, like your paper is becoming deeply, deeply unserious. So the media coverage, I think, is just worth talking about because it shows the anxieties about the BRICS summit in the West, and it shows that the West is becoming increasingly out of touch with reality. The one positive thing that we can talk about, without knowing the final shakeout of the BRICS summit, what happens, what the end announcements are, and so on, is that a day or two before the BRICS summit, India and China announced that they've agreed on a patrolling arrangement to de-escalate tension along the disputed Himalayan border. Just to go into a little bit about what's been happening there. India and China are next to each other. They're very large countries. They haven't always had the best history in terms of diplomatic relations, geopolitical relations, and so on. And there's been flare-ups on the border from time to time. The last one, they were called the Galwan Valley clashes. I think they were in 2020. And they were kind of an odd thing where the Chinese and the Indian armies started hitting each other with sticks and bricks. Kind of an odd situation. I don't really fully understand it. But anyway, that sparked off a kind of a border dispute that's been going on since then. Putting this on the table ahead of this BRICS meeting, to my mind, is enormously important in terms of symbolism, because when I started talking about the BRICS back about 2 years ago, just after the Ukraine war, I'd always get pushback on Twitter, which I like to call pushback from the weird liberal racist crowd. So it's typically people who would lecture you on, all sorts of oppression narratives and, post-colonial discourse or whatever. They tell you that if you complain about immigration, you're a racist or something like that. And then when it goes into foreign policy, they instantly revert to basic take of India and China will never sort out their differences because they're not sufficiently civilized to engage in diplomacy like we are in the West. So we'll continue to basically drive a wedge between them and trick them into not being able to form close relationships. I can't think of anything more racist than this point of view. It is straight out of 19th century British imperialism, frankly. The fact that people go around and wear little rainbow flags on their blazer when they're making these arguments is just infinitely amusing to me. But what's happening now is immediately disproving the weirdo liberal racist who makes these arguments. It is now very clear that these countries can actually put aside their differences when they see that there is bigger fish to fry, and that the rewards of putting aside a troublesome border dispute might actually be worth it if you're talking about kind of building a new global system, new systems of trade and so on. And especially so when you're seeing these enormous geopolitical shifts and the West is becoming very hostile and so on. They say, finally, maybe we should stop the guys hitting each other with sticks, which looks silly anyway, and just come to an agreement on some border region that's probably in the mountains anyway. Put that aside and sit down and let's talk about alternative to SWIFT. So I think this announcement has thoroughly disproven the weird liberal racist argument against the coherence of BRICS.
Yeah, can I defend a little bit the view that countries like China and India just can't get along well enough? They can't reach agreements. People say that about China and Russia as well, and Russia and India, and basically everybody outside the very closely knit Western alliance. I don't think it comes from this kind of old-fashioned Whiggish liberal imperialist idea that these people simply aren't civilized enough to be able to do it. They're not subtle and agreement capable enough to be able to reach these agreements. I don't think it's that at all. I think it comes more from the post 1945 view in the West of what diplomacy and alliances and agreements involve. I think that Western countries are tightly knit, across a range of interconnecting institutions, militarily, economically, diplomatically, financially, and in terms of trade as well. And they're so closely knit and so closely cleaved to the Washington-led world order that they struggle to see any kind of friendly relations that could exist outside of that extremely closely knit, almost supernatural system. They fail to see that nations can not have a unified military, not have a unified diplomatic outlook, not have a unified financial, trade, and economic system, and yet still get along very well and still make deals, either diplomatically or trade deals or finance deals that are in their country's national interests. It seems weird for them to see that, say, India and China could reach a trade agreement, or Russia and China could reach a trade agreement, when these countries aren't, locked in the same way that London is to Washington or Paris is to Berlin, right? Where they're all part of the same, military alliance. They're all part of the same free trade zone. They're all part of the same global financial system and diplomatic system. It's weird to the European mind to think that could be possible. But in fact, that is the way that diplomacy and relations between countries was done before 1945. It's just the way things happen, and it's like we've forgotten that's the case. On the agreement between India and China to renormalize relations and to end, for now, I guess, the dispute in the frontier region between the two countries. I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but I believe it's the Ladakh region. I would say this: there's a really good geostrategic, kind of old-fashioned geostrategic region for China to want to maintain simmering, smouldering relations in that region. If India has to maintain a large ground army, not only to defend against a potential war with Pakistan, but also to deal with China's influence in disputed regions in India's northeast, then it would make it extremely difficult for China to develop the sort of naval presence that could interfere with China's growing presence within the Indian Ocean. Don't forget that India has control over the Andaman Islands. Now, the Andaman Islands are a kind of a long archipelago, a long thin strip of archipelago that essentially stretch in an arc from the southern tip of Myanmar, Burma, in the Bay of Bengal, to the northern tip of Indonesia, and essentially control the entrance or exit, depending on which way you're looking at it, to the Strait of Malacca, which is, of course, crucial for Chinese trade with the Middle East, which means the energy trade. China is now the largest importer of Middle Eastern oil. If India was ever able to kind of militarize those islands, if it ever had a navy capable of doing that and capable of controlling the Indian Ocean and especially the Bay of Bengal, it would cause huge problems for China in terms of its ability to get at that oil and to protect its trade of that oil. And it's well known that China has set up the so-called String of Pearls, which includes ports in places like Sri Lanka, which would allow it to project power into that crucial trading lane. But at the same time, there's also a really good geostrategic reason for both India and China to want to cool this off. India and China are really big trading partners with each other. And in fact, since 2022, so only 2 years ago, I believe I'm right in saying that trade has expanded between India and China to the extent that India's trade deficit with China has doubled. India would really benefit from Chinese investment, both as a way of recycling the capital that goes out of India to China in that trade deficit relationship, but also because, building some of the factories that China has gained, become extremely expert in and has propelled China's economy, but perhaps now is a little bit low down the value chain for China to want to concentrate on. Building some of those factories in India would be a huge boost for the Indians. Maintaining good relations with China would be a huge benefit for the Indians. And I think it would generally fit in with the Indian position of multi-alignment and non-alignment, being aligned and yet not aligned with everybody simultaneously, and to be able to maintain good trading and diplomatic relations with many countries, no matter which bloc they're a part of. This philosophy, this idea has been deep-seated in India since it gained its independence. And I think from China's view as well, it would be really good. It would be really good to try to maintain good relations with India so that it isn't pushed entirely into the Western Bloc. Famously, India is already part of the Quad, which involves the US, Japan, and Australia, as well as India. And I think the last thing that the Chinese would want is for India to fall entirely into the US side of the ledger, insofar as the coming conflict in the Western Pacific between China and the United States. So I think there are very good reasons, despite perhaps China having certain geostrategic reasons for not wanting India getting comfortable and rich enough to build a powerful navy. I think there are good reasons at the moment for China and India to want to have some kind of détente and want to build closer relations on both sides of that ledger. And I think it's just a classic example of two countries that don't have to be best buddies. They don't have to be entirely integrated across the financial, the trade, the macroeconomic, the diplomatic, and the military spheres to be able to do deals that improve relations between the two countries, and which ultimately lead to positive outcomes in each nation's national interest. Keir, there and everywhere. A bombshell report has dropped yesterday at the time of recording, which was Tuesday, the 22nd of October. It is written by renowned or infamous, depending on how you look at it, investigative reporter Matt Taibbi, he of the famous Goldman Sachs Vampire Squid article and the Twitter files, as well as former US Senate investigator Paul Thacker, I'm not sure how to pronounce that properly in the American way. Anyway, what they have revealed is that a charity or activist organization called Center for Combating Digital Hate, the CCDH, which is an organization very closely connected with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer through his election Svengali and current Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, has been engaged in a campaign in America to try to, quote, kill Elon Musk's Twitter, and has been building relations with US political operatives, US politicians, and also the Biden-Harris White House toward the end of trying to suppress and eventually, in fact, kill Elon Musk's Twitter. Now, this has become a huge deal in the US because it comes hot on the heels of a story that the chief of operations of the Labour Party had been soliciting Labour Party activists from the UK to travel to the US and campaign on behalf of the Harris-Walz campaign for president in 2024. And also revelations in Politico that Morgan McSweeney and another organisation that he founded, Labour Together, which was crucial in getting Keir Starmer elected as leader of the Labour Party and ultimately as Prime Minister, have been offering strategic advice to the Kamala Harris campaign for president on a range of matters in the United States. So why is this story important for the UK? Obviously, it's important to America. The Trump campaign has officially lodged a complaint with the Electoral Commission related to this meddling of the UK in UK affairs. But why is this important? Well, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, the CCDH, was co-founded, as I say, by Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff. He's thought to be incredibly close and influential with regard to Keir Starmer. And he was certainly the driving force behind getting Keir Starmer into a position of power within the Labour Party as leader and ultimately as Prime Minister. Now, Morgan McSweeney also founded Labour Together, and Labour Together and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, as recently as last year, shared an address together. And Morgan McSweeney was previously a director of the CCDH. Matt Taibbi and Mr. Thacker, or Thaker, depending on how you are going to pronounce that, have said that the CCDH has been, for the last 3 years, rolling out what very much looks like a campaign in America similar to those which they very successfully ran in the UK. So one of the things that the CCDH did in the UK, just to give one example of how they work, is they attacked a left-wing pro-Jeremy Corbyn media outlet called The Canary. And what they tried to do is they tried to crush The Canary's advertising and sponsorship revenue and detach it from any kind of links with credible centres of political power. And they were so successful in doing that they forced The Canary to engage in a round of job cuts and cost-cutting exercises. Now, apparently, they're rolling out these tactics in America. And the whistleblowers provided Taibbi and Thaker with documents that show that the main priority within the CCDH's plans in America was to, quote, kill Elon Musk's Twitter. Now, this was a priority for them per these documents that Taibbi and Thacker have got, which appear to show that this was a priority for the CCDH in America for months, even as other issues that they wanted to focus on came and went. So, you have this group which engages in tactics to deprive organizations whose political views and whose output the CCDH themselves dislike, to deprive those organizations of financial support, of advertising, and sully their reputations. And it's very closely linked with Keir Starmer through Morgan McSweeney, who was a co-founder both of the CCDH and Labour Together, which put Keir Starmer in power and managed to destroy Keir Starmer's opponents within the Labour Party and the broader left-wing milieu in the UK. And now they're getting involved in attacking Elon Musk and Twitter at the same time that the UK government is engaged in a feud with Twitter and especially Elon Musk, which they have been after the Southport riots. I mean, this is really kind of shady stuff in my view, and I think it's extremely foolish of the UK government to allow this sort of thing to go on. Why is that? Well, what if Donald Trump wins the next US election? I mean, I don't know Donald Trump personally. I don't take a lot of the things that are said about him in the media too seriously. It seems very hysterical to me. But he does not seem like the sort of person who would forgive something like this too easily. He seems like the sort of person who would hold a grudge against people. So what happens if he is elected president in November, as many people, including you, Philip Pilkington, seem to think? Nothing good for Anglo-American relations, especially given we're increasingly reliant on America for our security, given our parlous military situation. So I think it's very foolish indeed. I think it shows some very shady dealing. And I think there could be significant political and diplomatic and security ramifications for the UK. It's a really big story, and I think it's going to get bigger.
I absolutely agree, and I wish it hadn't broken as soon as it did, because actually, I think we kind of have to apologize to listeners. There's been a very big trend growing about this information and political warfare online, and we haven't actually really covered it. So the first time in history since the beginning of the podcast, Multipolarity has been behind the curve, not in private, but in public. So apologies to listeners for that. So I guess we kind of have to try and sketch out what on earth is going on here, because it is incredibly important. Well, start from the beginning. The first thing is that all these shenanigans around Twitter, around censorship, around election meddling, which is what this is. It's British Labour Party activists meddling in the American election, which is nuts. It's so beyond diplomatic protocol. It's not even funny. All of this is going to, as you say, destroy Anglo-American relations. That really has to be understood. Unless Kamala Harris pulls off a victory and the Democrats remain in charge from here till kingdom come, Britain has truly poisoned its relationship with the United States, at least one side of the aisle in the United States. And from here on, it will be seen as a hostile country, much in the way that American liberals view, for example, Hungary, say. It'll be very similar to that. I will also say that American conservatives, knowing many of them, have long been skeptical of Britain because of some of the shall we say, attacks on free speech in Britain itself. They watch what happens in Britain with some of the excessive laws and so on. You can see all this on Twitter. It's no secret. And when you talk to somebody in the Republican Party these days, even somebody with an Anglo last name, whose grandfather was probably very proud of their heritage as kind of a WASP elite or whatever, if you talk to these people now, they despair about what's happening in Britain. It's very noticeable. So this is being added on top of that already kind of layer of distaste about some of the political trends in Britain. So that's the first thing to say. Anglo-American relations will never be the same about this. And that leads us to the broader question, which we don't have time to cover in one section, and I wish we'd got to it before this story broke, but sometimes things don't work out that way. This is all part of a broader trend, and that trend is, there's a lot of parts to that trend, but we can only really focus on one or two now. The first is the homogenization of the media sphere that the internet and social media has allowed. And what this has done, as I know, Andrew, you've written many things about this in the past. What it's done is it's made English-speaking countries, especially, even non-English-speaking countries in Europe, but especially English-speaking countries, become pretty much obsessed with American politics. I mean, a lot of the time now you could go to London and go to a dinner party and people won't discuss British politics as much as they'll discuss American politics. This is because of a homogenization of the media sphere. And if you're old enough to remember the media before this homogenization took place, which I vaguely do, American issues, you'd see them on BBC News or, wherever in the press, but they'd be kind of on page 5 and they'd be, unless there was something huge going on, maybe a presidential election or something like that, you wouldn't pay that much attention. Not so much the case now. So first of all, there's been this homogenization of the political sphere, which has encouraged basically people in Britain, like these Labour Party activists, to start to think of themselves almost as imperial subjects rather than British subjects. And so they feel themselves like entitled to go over and partake in politics in Washington, D.C. By the way, having somewhat done this myself, I can kind of understand the mindset. I've never been involved in party politics in DC, and I wouldn't do it for that reason, for the same reason as what these people are about to learn. But you do actually tend to go over that. I've been over there to debate, American policy issues, and it does actually feel very natural. And that's part of this homogenization. The second component to this process is information control and so on, censorship, internet censorship, call it what you will, the free speech debate, as it were. And this debate is actually very high stakes. The reason that this censorship and so on has been brought in, as has been very well covered by a former State Department official with a fairly large Twitter account called Mike Benz. You can go and watch his lectures. He gave one at NatCon. He gave one at Hillsdale recently. And as he explains, the anti-disinformation movement, or if you want to call it a movement, it's kind of organized, so it's probably not a movement, is aimed at trying to stop foreign, or at least it started as trying to aim at stop foreign interference on the internet. This is, all the kind of things. Russian influence in Brexit, supposed Russian influence in Brexit, supposed Russian influence in the Donald Trump 2016 election, all that stuff. The, national security blob effectively freaked out because this new media, was not clearly sanitized from foreign influence. And so they started trying to gain control over it. Well, look what's happened. What's happened is that these groups that are going around the world and meeting with each other and so on, all the stuff you just talked about, are destabilizing Western diplomatic relations. And although the immediate outcome of this crack between America and Britain and the Labour Party being engaged in all this, that specific event was not predictable. But the overall effect of what they were doing was predictable. I call what they've created a paranoia machine, because that's what it is. It's why you hear about everything being influenced, and there's influence here and there's influence there, and we have to clamp down here and clamp down there. It's like this really, really paranoid machine that takes holds of people's brains and makes them stop thinking clearly. And what that's done is it's allowed, for example, these Labour Party people to justify to themselves to go and do things in America that are so far outside international diplomatic norms, especially given the fact that they're the smaller country going over to the bigger country and picking political fights. This is so unwise. You could go back to 16th century and a diplomat could tell you that this is not the way to do things. But because they've convinced themselves, because they're locked into the paranoia machine and they're convincing themselves that Trump isn't just a political candidate, he's part of some global force, spooky force that is foreign meddling and is behind Brexit and Trump, this paranoid way of viewing the world, because they're locked into that, they justify to themselves doing things that 10 or 15 years ago would have been so out of bounds in any normal country. Maybe a pariah state would do stuff like this, but they would be so far outside the bounds of what to do in a normal country. And if you tried to do it, I'd imagine that, diplomats would have a word with your government and say, you can't do that or whatever. So basically, we're seeing all this now come to a head. And this is probably going to change how we talk about all this disinformation stuff and everything forever. And of course, the last thing to say is, standing at the very center of this is Elon Musk, because he's taken a stance with Twitter in favor of free speech, but it's much broader than free speech. I don't think Musk is just standing, quote unquote, for free speech. I think he and a group of Silicon Valley people recognize that this disinformation brigade, who are mostly like arts degrees grads and stuff, they don't really understand the technology, and the Silicon Valley guys do. And the Silicon Valley guys can see what the eventual chaotic outcome of their attempts to overly control this stuff are. And now we're seeing it. I'll leave it with this, right? If you're listening and you're like, yeah, Russia are controlling elections and we have to prevent that and it's all really dangerous. Okay, we've seen the outcomes now. What is worse? The Russians buying a few social media ads during Brexit, which have an indeterminate effect, probably close to zero, or buying a few election ads in the Trump campaign, again, indeterminate effect, probably close to zero. That's on the one hand. Now we see what's on the other hand. The possible destruction, and I'm not speaking hyperbolically here, the possible destruction of diplomatic relations between two major Western powers. Which is more destructive, the Facebook ads or the destruction of the diplomatic relations? It's obvious which is more destructive. Well, the one driving the diplomatic relations, no one's going to allege there's any Russians behind this. It was the Labour Party. It was these Labour Party activists. So anyone who wants to try and see clearly the impact of social media and where the risks actually lie should be able to see now that the paranoia machine and the disinformation industrial complex, that is far, far more dangerous to Western democracies, to diplomatic relations between Western powers, than anyone buying a few Facebook ads to try and promote one candidate or the other in an election.